Ever cut someone off and never looked back? Right, I did, if so.
I remember walking into the room that evening with a mix of pride and unease, because it was the celebration for my promotion, the one I had worked for relentlessly over the past 3 years. And I could feel the weight of my family's expectations pressing down on me before I even made it to the center of attention. And the moment I raised my glass to join the toast, my father, without hesitation or even a hint of subtlety, leaned in slightly. Smiling in that way he always did when he thought he was imparting wisdom, and said, "Your sister will always outshine you," and the words hit me like a cold splash of water, leaving me momentarily stunned because I had spent so many years striving for recognition and respect. Not just at work, but in our family, and I had assumed that this evening would finally be mine, that for once, someone would see me for what I had earned. Yet the moment passed, and everyone around the table laughed awkwardly. Not quite sure whether to pretend this was a joke or to acknowledge the underlying tension that none of us could ignore. I smiled politely, raising my glass higher and murmuring a quiet "thank you," while my father's gaze lingered on me, satisfied with the disturbance he had caused, and I felt the burn of his favoritism and the years of subtle, persistent condescension toward me flare up in a way that made me both furious and determined, because I realized in that instant that if I wanted anyone to take me seriously, I had to do more than just work hard or stay silent. I had to plan, to act, and to control the narrative so that the people who mattered, both at work and at home, would finally understand that I was not just capable but unstoppable. My boss, who had been standing at the edge of the group with a quiet smile, tilted his head slightly at the remark, his eyebrow raising just enough to signal that he had caught the implication of my father's comment. And I knew immediately that he was the only person in that room who could see the subtle injustice without needing an explanation, which made me feel both exposed and reassured, and in that instant, I made a mental note to trust him with the information I had been gathering about my sister's performance at work, which had been deteriorating steadily for months, even though no one at home seemed to care because they were blinded by favoritism and old habits. And I realized that the stage was set for a confrontation that would be both public and precise, one that would force my father, and perhaps my sister, to face consequences they had never anticipated, and that I would have to wait for the exact right moment to execute. As the toast continued, I could hear the murmurs of colleagues who had been listening with polite smiles, but increasingly curious glances, trying to decipher the tension between my father's words and the reactions around the room. And I felt a mix of amusement and vindication because I had always suspected that my father's opinion carried more weight at family gatherings than it did anywhere else, and yet here, in front of my professional peers, it revealed itself to be both flawed and short-sighted. A mistake that I intended to exploit when the opportunity presented itself, and I had been planning this for months, silently observing my sister's decisions, tracking her projects, noting her mistakes, and quietly ensuring that I had every fact aligned with the narrative I would reveal, because the power of truth is undeniable when wielded at the right time in front of the right audience. I could see the slight shift in my father's demeanor as I raised my glass, keeping my smile intact while thinking about every moment that had led to this evening, the countless hours I had worked late into the night, the promotions I had earned quietly while my sister received accolades and praise without even trying, and the conversations I had avoided with my parents where they would casually dismiss my achievements as expected or inconsequential, always elevating her above me and making it clear that no matter what I accomplished, I would always be the lesser child in their eyes, and in that moment, I made a silent vow that the next few minutes would rewrite that perception permanently, but it had to be executed with precision, calmness, and undeniable evidence, because the kind of satisfaction I sought was not in yelling, not in confrontation, but in watching the realization settle in on my father's face, and knowing that every word, every detail, every small piece of preparation would make the impact irreversible. The room felt heavy with anticipation even though no one could articulate it yet, and I could see my colleagues exchanging glances, some recognizing the underlying tension and others simply curious. And it became clear to me that the evening had transformed from a celebration into a stage for revelation, and the thrill of knowing I had the upper hand, even if silently, surged through me, making my heart pound with a combination of anxiety and elation. Because everything I had endured, the years of subtle undermining, the constant comparisons, the favoritism, the frustration of being consistently dismissed, had led to this precise moment where I could finally, cleverly, and immovably assert my place not just professionally, but personally, in the eyes of everyone who mattered. And as I sipped from my glass and nodded politely to my father, I felt the quiet power of the plan I had been cultivating, knowing that in just a matter of moments, the entire dynamic would shift irrevocably. And while my smile remained polite and composed, inside I was already savoring the exact point at which the truth would land, clean, sharp, and undeniable. And then I saw it, subtle but unmistakable, my boss's slight head tilt, the barely perceptible pause as he realized what my father had just said, and I understood instantly that the stage was set, that the audience was primed, and that all of my preparation, every quiet effort to gather evidence, every patient observation of my sister's missteps, was about to converge into a moment that would leave everyone, including my father, stunned, because in that room, surrounded by peers and family alike, I would not just be recognized for my work, I would be acknowledged for my intelligence, patience, and ability to act decisively, and while the words had not yet been spoken, I knew that the tide was turning, that the opportunity to assert control and deliver a form of justice that felt both satisfying and clever was seconds away. And I could not help but feel the rush of anticipation, knowing that the evening I had once dreaded for its potential humiliation was about to become the evening that would redefine my place in every meaningful sense of the word. I had spent years trying to understand why my father's admiration seemed reserved exclusively for my sister, why every achievement I celebrated at home was met with a polite nod or a half-smile while hers was celebrated as if the sun itself had risen just to highlight her brilliance, and over time, I had learned to navigate the tension, to endure the constant comparisons, the subtle dismissals, and the reminders that in our family hierarchy, I would always be the one who worked hard but never truly earned recognition, and yet, despite the sting of that favoritism, I had never allowed it to define my ambitions because I knew that my worth was not determined by parental approval, but by the results I could achieve through diligence, intelligence, and patience, which was why I had poured every ounce of energy into my career, meticulously planning my steps, making connections, learning the intricacies of the business, and quietly excelling in ways that my family would never have suspected. Because I had realized early on that if I wanted them to see me as equal, or better, I would need to build an undeniable foundation that could not be ignored, and every project I took on, every challenge I overcame, was carefully documented in my mind, creating a mental record of achievements that I knew would someday prove invaluable when the time came to assert myself in a way they could not dispute. I remembered the countless evenings in my apartment after work, sitting with spreadsheets, reports, and performance reviews spread across the table, reviewing not only my own contributions, but also quietly tracking my sister's decisions, the ones she made under pressure and without careful consideration, noting every error, every missed deadline, and every sign of overconfidence, because I understood that while she thrived in the glow of immediate praise, the structure of sustained success was not her strength, and I had learned to recognize patterns, to see the cracks forming in the image she presented to our parents, and to know that patience would be my greatest ally. That the perfect moment to reveal the truth would not come from anger or confrontation, but from a strategic exposure that would leave no room for doubt or excuse, and I had rehearsed scenarios in my mind for months, imagining my father's reaction, my sister's confusion, and the subtle but powerful satisfaction of watching my professional confidence and careful planning outshine the favoritism that had long shielded her from accountability. Family gatherings had always been a test of endurance, and I had learned to navigate them with grace, knowing that my father's praise was seldom based on merit and more often on perception, which was why I had chosen to approach my work with a quiet intensity, letting results speak for themselves while maintaining a carefully composed demeanor in social settings, because I understood that the moment I allowed frustration or resentment to show, it would undermine every bit of credibility I had worked so hard to build, and that self-control, paired with strategic observation, was the tool that would allow me to finally level the playing field. To demonstrate in a way that could not be denied that I was not only competent, but in many ways superior to the sibling my parents had always elevated above me. I had also observed the subtle dynamics at work, noting how colleagues responded to my sister's decisions, how she handled pressure, and where the cracks in her authority were most evident. And I had quietly documented the instances where her oversight or mistakes caused real consequences, because I knew that if I ever had to act publicly, evidence would be my ally, not aggression or confrontation, and the more I collected, the more confident I became that the time was approaching when the revelation would be both impactful and undeniable, exposing the disparity between perception and reality in a single, decisive moment that would leave everyone, especially my father, forced to acknowledge the truth, whether they liked it or not. And I had rehearsed mentally how I would remain composed, how I would let the reactions unfold naturally, and how I would enjoy, in a quiet but unshakable way, the satisfaction of seeing the scales of recognition finally tip in my favor. As the promotion celebration loomed closer in my mind, I reflected on the subtle conversations that had taken place in recent weeks, the casual boasting by my sister about projects she had led, and the way my father's words of approval had encouraged her overconfidence, and I realized that the contrast between her public persona and the reality of her performance created a window of opportunity that I could exploit with careful timing. Because while she had relied on charm, familial favoritism, and superficial accomplishments, I had built a record of sustained, quantifiable success, one that would resonate not only with my boss and colleagues, but with my father in a way that could no longer be ignored, and the anticipation of that moment. The knowledge that all my patience and preparation had led to this tipping point filled me with a sense of power and purpose that made the months of quiet observation, the sleepless nights, and the careful planning feel entirely worthwhile, because I understood that the satisfaction I sought would not come from anger or revenge alone, but from the undeniable exposure of reality in a moment that was both public and precise, and that this moment would fundamentally shift the perception of my abilities in a way that my father had never imagined. I knew that my father would never willingly admit that he had misjudged the trajectory of our careers, that he would cling to his perception of my sister as superior, and that my sister herself would be unprepared for the exposure that was approaching. And yet, I also knew that the combination of careful planning, documented evidence, and flawless execution would create a scenario in which neither of them could deny the outcome, leaving me not only vindicated but in complete control of the narrative, which was the ultimate satisfaction I had been cultivating for years, because it was not merely about personal success, but about proving, to my family and to myself, that patience, intelligence, and strategic action were far more powerful than favoritism, superficial charm, or unearned praise. And as I imagined the toast, the raised glasses, and the subtle reactions of my colleagues and family, I could feel the tension building. The anticipation of the moment when the truth would finally land, and I realized that the story of my career, of my careful planning and quiet triumphs, was about to intersect with family dynamics in a way that would leave a lasting impression, both emotionally and professionally, creating a narrative in which the outcome was inevitable and brilliant in its precision. The night of the celebration arrived, and even as I walked into the room, I could feel the familiar tension in the air, the unspoken hierarchy my father had tried to enforce for years, lingering in every corner. And I reminded myself that everything had been planned with meticulous precision, from the timing of my toast to the subtle cues that would allow me to expose the truth about my sister without seeming aggressive or confrontational, because I knew that if I rushed, if I allowed impatience to dictate my actions, all of my preparation could unravel in a single misstep, and the satisfaction I had been cultivating for months would vanish before it had a chance to land, leaving only frustration and resentment, which were emotions I had long learned to set aside in favor of strategic patience, knowing that in moments like this, control and timing were far more powerful than anger or impulsiveness. And the plan I had constructed in my mind was designed to maximize impact, leaving my father visibly unsettled and my sister entirely unprepared to respond, and I could feel the weight of that anticipation pressing down on me in the best way possible. Because the thrill of finally revealing the truth in a setting where everyone was watching was unlike anything I had experienced, and I had never been more focused, more determined, or more certain that the moment would achieve exactly what I had intended. As I approached the center of the room, glass in hand, my father's eyes met mine, and I could see the faint smirk of superiority that he wore whenever he felt certain that one of his children was in their place, and in that instant, I felt a surge of clarity. Realizing that the entire gathering had been framed in his mind as a performance in which my sister would shine and I would merely exist in the background, tolerated but never celebrated, and I allowed myself a small, private acknowledgement of how wrong he was, knowing that soon his certainty would crumble under the weight of undeniable reality, because while he had long relied on perception and favoritism to guide his judgment, I had built a record of measurable achievements, careful observation, and deliberate preparation that would speak louder than his words ever could, and I reminded myself that my sister's overconfidence, her reliance on charm over competence, and her habit of underestimating consequences would all contribute to the impact of what was about to unfold, leaving her flustered and exposed while I maintained the calm composure that I had cultivated for months, silently savoring the power of anticipation and the satisfaction of executing a plan that was as precise as it was inevitable. When the room quieted and all eyes turned toward me, I began to speak, keeping my tone polite, warm, and entirely conversational, as though I were simply sharing an anecdote rather than delivering a carefully calculated revelation, because I knew that any hint of vindictiveness or aggression could undermine the effect, and I started by acknowledging my colleagues, thanking them for their support and collaboration, and then I seamlessly shifted to the projects my team had accomplished over the past year, highlighting specific outcomes, measurable improvements, and strategic decisions that had contributed directly to the company's growth and success. And I noticed, with a quiet thrill, the subtle nods of recognition from my boss, who clearly understood the depth of the work I had done, and I allowed my praise for my team to linger just long enough to emphasize my leadership, dedication, and competence without appearing boastful, because I knew that establishing my credibility in this space was critical before introducing the next, more personal element of my message, the one that would strike at the heart of my father's favoritism and my sister's inflated sense of security. At the precise moment, I introduced the evidence that would dismantle my sister's aura of competence without attacking her personally, recounting with clarity and authority the series of decisions she had made in recent months that had resulted in missed deadlines, budget misallocations, and preventable errors, all presented with careful context and documentation that left no room for argument. And as I laid out the facts, I could feel the shift in the room, the subtle tightening of jaws, the widening of eyes, and the barely perceptible tension that rose like an invisible wave. And then, without missing a beat, I delivered the final piece of the revelation, noting, with the calm authority I had rehearsed, that my sister's position had already been reviewed and terminated that very morning due to her repeated failures to meet the standards expected of her role, and I watched as the room processed the information, silence falling over the space, broken only by the faint coughs of disbelief, the stifled exclamations of my colleagues, and the unmistakable blanching of my father's face as he realized that the hierarchy he had long enforced, the favoritism he had assumed was harmless, and the assumptions he had made about competence and recognition had all been thoroughly dismantled in a single, precise moment. And I felt a surge of satisfaction, not from cruelty, but from the elegance and inevitability of the outcome, because everything I had endured, observed, and prepared for had led to this point, and the impact was absolute. My sister's expression shifted rapidly from smug confidence to confusion, then to panic as she tried to find words, any words, to counter the irrefutable evidence I had presented, and I maintained my composure, allowing her discomfort to unfold naturally, because the brilliance of the moment was in its inevitability and clarity, and not in my personal satisfaction, which, though profound, was secondary to the revelation itself. And I could see my father struggling internally, caught between pride, disbelief, and the realization that he had misjudged both of his children in a way that could no longer be ignored. And in that silence, heavy with anticipation, I recognized that the balance had shifted irrevocably, that the control I had quietly cultivated over months of preparation had finally materialized, and that the subtle, careful patience I had exercised had produced a moment of justice, clarity, and undeniable validation that would resonate far beyond the confines of that room, leaving an impression that was as satisfying emotionally as it was strategically brilliant. The moments after the revelation were a delicate storm, where the tension in the room thickened and the weight of truth pressed down on everyone present, and I watched as my father's confident posture crumbled imperceptibly, his jaw tightening, eyes darting to my sister, and then back to me, as if searching for an explanation that could reconcile his long-held perception of her superiority with the undeniable facts I had just laid bare. And in that instant, I realized the true power of preparation and patience, because the years of quiet observation, meticulous documentation, and strategic planning had culminated in a single, precise moment where reality could no longer be denied. And the very foundation of favoritism that had dictated our family dynamics was being challenged in a way that could not be ignored, dismissed, or spun into another version of justification. And the subtle shock on my sister's face, followed by the rapid flicker of panic, confirmed that she had never anticipated being held accountable in this manner, that the confidence she had relied upon, both in her professional environment and within the family, was a fragile construct easily dismantled by the methodical presentation of evidence and the calm authority of someone who had spent years quietly mastering their craft while everyone else assumed they were merely existing in the background. As the initial shockwave settled, I noticed the quiet murmurs among my colleagues, the polite but astonished exchanges of disbelief, and the subtle nods that acknowledged the rigor and impact of my leadership. And I allowed myself a fleeting moment to savor the weight of validation that came not from immediate praise, but from the undeniable recognition that the work I had accomplished could not be disputed. And in that same moment, I recognized that my father's internal struggle was as much about ego as it was about favoritism, because he had built a narrative in his mind over decades in which my sister was the standard-bearer of success in the family, a narrative that granted him a sense of certainty and authority. And now that narrative was unraveling before his eyes, leaving him exposed to the undeniable conclusion that his judgment had been flawed, and that the reality of competence, diligence, and strategic foresight was something he had failed to recognize in his own child. And the satisfaction I felt in observing that cognitive dissonance was profound, because it was not rooted in cruelty, but in the elegant inevitability of a plan executed with precision and patience over years of careful preparation. And I knew that the full impact was only beginning to settle in as my father processed what had transpired. My sister, still grappling with the sudden exposure of her missteps, attempted to regain composure, to interject explanations, and to defend herself, and in doing so, she revealed the very gaps in understanding, foresight, and accountability that had led to her termination. And as she spoke, stumbling over her words, I realized that her panic, though emotionally charged and deeply personal to her, was also a confirmation of the accuracy and effectiveness of my presentation, because the calm clarity with which I had delivered facts and evidence left no room for argument, no space for spin, and no possibility of redirecting blame, and I could feel a shift not only in my sister's perception of the situation, but also in my father's. Because the subtle discomfort of watching the reality unfold before him, of seeing favoritism challenged in such an undeniable and public way, created a dynamic in which authority, perception, and pride collided with truth. And the balance of emotional and intellectual control was now fully in my favor, leaving me in a position of quiet yet undeniable power, where every word, pause, and fact I had deployed contributed to a sense of inevitability and justice that was impossible to dispute. As the room gradually regained a semblance of calm, I noticed the way colleagues began to look at me differently, not with envy or suspicion, but with a sense of recognition for the strategic brilliance and leadership I had displayed. And the subtle acknowledgement that while my sister had relied on charm, perception, and parental favoritism, I had relied on competence, diligence, and patience, and that contrast could not be ignored, minimized, or diminished. And I understood that the next phase was critical, because while the immediate shock had been powerful, leaving a lasting impression required not only the exposure of truth, but also the demonstration of sustained capability, control, and the capacity to manage the fallout with composure, intelligence, and strategic foresight, which was why I continued to speak calmly, addressing questions with measured responses, providing clarification without condescension, and allowing my presence to signal confidence, authority, and the capacity to lead, because the subtle execution of poise under pressure was as crucial as the revelation itself, and every gesture, every carefully chosen word, contributed to the sense of a masterful plan coming to fruition. Throughout the remainder of the evening, I observed my father's reactions with a mix of satisfaction and quiet reflection, noticing how he shifted from disbelief to forced consideration, how the tension in his posture suggested an internal reckoning, and how the unspoken acknowledgement of my capabilities began to replace the habitual favoritism he had shown my sister. And I understood that while family dynamics rarely changed overnight, the foundation had been shifted irrevocably, the scales of perception had been rebalanced, and I had achieved not only professional recognition, but also a profound personal validation, because the careful orchestration of years of preparation, strategic observation, and patient calculation had culminated in a moment where justice, recognition, and control intersected perfectly, leaving the outcome clear, the impact undeniable, and the sense of triumph both emotionally satisfying and strategically brilliant. In the days that followed the celebration, the tension that had been building in the household settled into a quiet, almost fragile equilibrium, where the aftershocks of that public revelation continued to ripple through every interaction. And I watched with a sense of quiet satisfaction as my father, who had once spoken with unquestioned authority about my sister's superiority, began to recalibrate his perceptions in ways that were subtle but unmistakably real. Because the power dynamics had shifted permanently, and I could see in every glance, every tone, and every carefully chosen word that he was processing not only the professional truth I had demonstrated, but also the personal implications of his long-standing favoritism, which now seemed both misguided and unnecessary. And while he had always believed that love could be measured by acknowledgement and comparison, he was slowly learning that respect, recognition, and credibility could not be dictated or forced, and that attempts to manipulate perception would ultimately fail in the face of evidence, preparation, and undeniable confidence, which was exactly what I had orchestrated from the very beginning, not for vengeance alone, but for the clarity and justice that came from exposing the truth with precision and patience. My sister, on the other hand, retreated into a mixture of denial and carefully masked shame, attempting to maintain appearances while quietly recalibrating her understanding of both her professional abilities and her standing within the family. And I noticed that she became more guarded, more careful in her interactions, and far more hesitant to assert authority or confidence in spaces where she had previously relied on charm, influence, or familial bias to carry her. And while I did not gloat or overtly manipulate, the subtle satisfaction of observing her constrained by the consequences of her own overconfidence and lack of foresight was profound, because it affirmed the strategic elegance of the plan I had executed, where accountability was imposed not through confrontation, but through careful timing, evidence, and unassailable clarity, leaving her to navigate the fallout with nothing but her own understanding and the undeniable reality that she had been overestimated for years, and that her position, privileges, and assumed superiority were no longer guaranteed by anyone, not even the father who had once openly declared her the shining standard of our family. In parallel, my professional environment began to reflect the full weight of what had transpired, as colleagues, Supervisors and subordinates recognized the combination of leadership, diligence, and strategic foresight that I had demonstrated. And the acknowledgement was not fleeting or superficial, but grounded in tangible results, documentation, and the visible impact of decisions I had made and executed with precision. Because the plan I had carefully constructed went far beyond a single celebratory moment and extended into the realm of ongoing credibility, competence, and authority, which could not be undermined by family politics or transient emotions, and I recognized that the brilliance of the outcome lay in the dual impact. My sister's reckoning, my father's recalibration, and the undeniable establishment of my professional stature, which collectively formed a foundation of respect, recognition, and satisfaction that could not be retroactively contested, diminished, or ignored. And the validation I experienced was profound because it was both emotional and strategic, satisfying the desire for justice and the need for clarity simultaneously. During family gatherings in the following weeks, the subtle power shift became increasingly evident, not through overt displays or confrontations, but in the quiet acknowledgement of competence and authority. In the hesitation of my sister before making assumptions, and in the measured, thoughtful way my father addressed me, which contrasted sharply with the unquestioned, biased certainty he had displayed before the revelation. And I found a deep satisfaction in seeing these changes manifest organically, because they were the result of an elegantly executed plan rather than coercion or overt manipulation, and the long-term implications were clear. The family dynamic, once rigidly dictated by favoritism, had been altered irreversibly, leaving me with a sense of accomplishment, control, and clarity that could not be undermined by nostalgia, resentment, or previous patterns of behavior. And I understood fully that the culmination of my actions had achieved the desired impact, not only on the people directly involved, but on the broader perception of my professional and personal agency, which had been the ultimate objective from the outset. In private moments, as I reflected on the months of preparation, observation, and careful calculation that had led to this point, I realized that the satisfaction I felt was not merely about proving my worth or exposing inequities, but about the realization that patience, strategic thinking, and precise execution could produce outcomes far more powerful and enduring than reactive emotion or immediate confrontation. And I recognized that the elegance of the plan lay in its invisibility until the decisive moment, in the inevitability of the impact once the truth was revealed, and in the careful orchestration of both professional and personal consequences that created a sense of justice, validation, and triumph that was deeply satisfying, both emotionally and strategically, leaving everyone involved to grapple with the consequences of their assumptions, behaviors, and biases, while I remained poised, respected, and undeniably in control of the narrative, having turned a long-standing dynamic of favoritism and underestimation into a moment of absolute clarity, irreversible change, and brilliant, satisfying victory. And as I reflected on the entire journey, I felt a profound sense of calm, knowing that the plan had worked exactly as intended, leaving no room for misinterpretation, no space for lingering doubt, and no possibility for the old hierarchy to reassert itself, because in both the professional sphere and within the family, the balance had shifted permanently. The truth had been established, and the brilliance of the outcome was undeniable.